Hello and welcome back. It's been a while, but here I am with PLM Talks, and I'm actually here with a super special guest who I was so glad was able to make time, and then forgive the fact I forgot that there was daylight savings time here and not in Australia. But I would like to welcome Kristin Holland to PLM Talks. Hello.
Hello, Pamela. It is a pleasure and a privilege to be with you today. Yeah,
so Kristin Holland is the creator of the much lauded Nocturnal Transmission short horror story podcast. You may have readers of my blog have probably seen me linking to that, since he did adapt 3 of my stories actually, and I would highly recommend subscribing to the podcast. It's amazing. But a versatile voice talent, he has worked for many years, not only as a voice actor, but also commercial voiceover artist and singer. He first became involved in the world of podcasting through contributions to the Simply Scary podcast. He can also be heard as the voice of Dr. Malcolm Ryder, parapsychologist, on the A Voice from Darkness podcast, another favorite of mine. Kristin resides in Melbourne in the state of Victoria, Australia, but is irreparably Tasmanian. Yes, just like the devil. His favorite drink is scotch, and his favorite music is good music, which I guess can be argued as to what that is. So again, welcome in.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
So, and again, sorry about daylight savings. I wish they would just abolish it, because it's so confusing when you're arranging any kind of international meetings. And I'm glad you were able to work with me.
Oh, look, happily, today I'm just here in the studio knocking around, editing together audio, so it didn't matter. I was just here in the position anyway.
Yeah, so you mentioned that you have a home studio, right? So we'll get into all that, but let's start with what got you into voice acting to begin with?
Well, my initial aspirations were for acting. And there was a period where I was doing a lot of acting training, a lot of acting classes and studying. And I did find in scene study classes and acting classes, I self-diagnosed at a certain point that I had a bit of a bad condition where I always wanted to do strange and interesting voices and accents for any character that came up. And in hindsight, looking back at my days of study, it was an impediment, because the whole purpose of the acting study was really, to work on issues apart from just coming up with funny voices. But that was a defining feature when I was an acting student. I just always was, fascinated with voices. So it wasn't that strange a transition to sort of then go into voice acting purely.
And what kind of voice acting are you involved with currently?
It's not so much voice acting, but I do commercial voiceover. I used to do quite a bit of it, where, just advertising for television ads and radio stations and, various voiceover work. I still do it, but not nearly as often as I used to. And as far as the voiceover acting, the voice acting is concerned, I get commissions from time to time. People ask me to perform things for them for various uses. I have my own show, of course, Nocturnal Transmissions, which is my primary sort of outlet for this. I, of course, as you mentioned, work on A Voice from Darkness. I've also worked on an Australian podcast series called Yowie. There have been a number of podcasts and things I've been on, over the years. What else? That's kind of the main the main amount of it. So it's a lot of podcast stuff, I suppose, primarily.
Yeah, well, I feel like recently podcasts have become way more popular than when people started first producing them, I think. I know, I feel like there's like a podcast for every situation out there now.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're speaking to, someone who is a big podcast fan. That's how I first approached this, was from being an avid listener to all kinds of podcasts. And then at some point a light bulb went off and I decided, maybe I should make one myself.
Do you have a top 3 you'd mention? as your favorites?
Oh, gosh. Well, I can mention podcasts that I would recommend people digging up. One of the most impressive ones I've listened to that wasn't an ongoing podcast was Dolly Parton's America, which I think I've even talked about on the show, and I think I've put a link on my website for the podcast. It's surprisingly moving, really interesting, and I'm not a Dolly Parton fan. I just had a friend who said, you should listen to this, and it is heaven. It's a wonderful podcast. Apart from that, I listen to a lot of movie review podcasts. I listen to the Empire Film podcast all the time. Find that very amusing. Red Valley is a good drama, getting into the realm of sort of horror kind of podcast I quite liked. There was one that came out called The Message, which was, again, a limited run drama series. There's a few. I mean, there are so many others. I used to listen to Night Vale back in the day, and a few other things.
Night Vale.
Yeah, I think we're all familiar with that one. But I'm pretty gregarious. I've got a lot of things on my, and I can admit there's a lot of boring stuff to listen to, a lot of current affairs and kind of news kind of podcast things. But I'm pretty gregarious in my podcast tastes.
Yeah, that's fair. If you haven't already, Last Known Position is a really good one. It's like a short run fiction podcast, and I quite enjoyed it.
Oh, okay. Yep, I've made a note. I'll find it.
Going back to your home studio, so obviously this is your livelihood, so you do have a space put aside for it. Can you kind of describe that, and also what I'm sure a lot of people who aspire to starting a podcast probably have these questions, and I was curious myself, since I felt forced to buy a microphone just for these interviews. So I didn't sound all like I'm coming from a tin can or something. But what kind of software and hardware do you use and or would recommend?
Well, the good news is it doesn't take a lot to be able to do it. You don't have to have a great deal of tech savvy with audio equipment or anything like that, or a great deal of money. My setup is pretty simple. I just use GarageBand on my Mac for all my audio editing. And that's a very, I'm sure a lot of people have that on their computers, or, if you're not running Apple stuff, of course, there are other things available on PCs, but it's a very simple audio equipment. The microphone I use, I just have a Rode, I think it's NT1 condenser mic, which is a pretty meat and potatoes, not a fancy sort of studio condenser mic. I did upgrade at one point to a Shure SM7B, which is kind of a broadcast mic that I encounter in studios all the time. Used to see them constantly. I was almost always working in those in professional environments. But I found for my purposes at home, my familiarity with my old mic, I ended up going back to it because I've spent so much time with it, and I just know exactly how it behaves. So yeah, it's not an expensive piece of equipment. And as far as sound baffling and so on is concerned, I have a little, essentially the prop where I live, I've converted the garage into a sort of a studio space. So I did put a lot of soundproofing in the ceiling and so on, but I don't have a lot of baffling around me as far as like over all the walls. I have a bit of a shield that goes around the environment where I'm working. It's just a thing on a stand. And, and a few well-positioned cushions to stop some bouncing off walls and things. One of the biggest problems I have is that I also have a lot of instruments in this area too, acoustic guitars and basses and things. And I have to be careful where I place them in the room, because when I shout, they pick up my voice and bounce it right back at me. So it's only the really dramatic stuff that becomes an issue.
It's like a really tense moment in the story, and you just hear bling.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, if I start yelling, you start to hear this weird resonating guitar bodies in the background. And I just jump up and move everything around and so on. But yeah. So the setup is very simple, very simple. And I'm just I run through a little, a little audio box interface into my computer. Those things, again, aren't terribly expensive or difficult to run.
All right. I mean, I'm sure that's encouraging to hear. I don't know if I could ever get into voice acting. I'm definitely one of those people who suffers chronically from hating the sound of my own voice. And when I edit my interviews, I try not to listen.
I don't think there's anyone in the world who doesn't feel that way. I know exactly what you're talking about. You listen back to your voice and it's never what you think it sounds like.
So then, what do you enjoy most about, so officially, you said it's not what you do. So I'm getting the industry terms, I guess. What you do for nocturnal transmissions, is that voice acting?
Oh, yes, I suppose it is.
But then you also do voice over. So
voiceover is, usually for commercial stuff. Like, I've done a lot of car ads and for instance, here in there are certain, like some radio breakfast shows and the like across the country. There are various of our capital cities where I sort of do links for some of the shows, like introducing, when they throw to a little voice to say you're listening to or such and such.
I'm never not going to be able to imagine your voice doing a car in the deep rumbly ominous narrator voice. It's give a Kia, doom.
I don't think there's ever been any cause for my host, the podcast host's voice, to ever appear in any
that's a shame.
advertising, which is I wonder what he could sell. One day there'll be a product.
One day. So I guess all that context was to make sure I was asking this question correctly. What do you enjoy most about voice acting?
Oh, it's the chance to perform, which is, a niche that I'm always keen to scratch. I over the years, I've done a little bit of film and television and theatre, but not a great deal, not as much as I'd like to. But it's a very difficult industry to sort of break into in a robust way. So in a sense, the voice acting is my way of making sure that I can still perform. And, it's that old thing that if, you can't land the job you want, then you have to create it for yourself. If you can't get into a play that you want to be in, you better write a play. Mm-hmm. And for me, the podcast was the answer to that conundrum of okay, I really enjoy voice acting particularly. So I need to create a platform for myself. So to go back to what you asked about what I enjoy about it most, I think it's the music and the rhythm in good narration and voice acting. I came to it through listening to a lot of audiobooks. And the good ones, there's it's like jazz, and even in acting too, when you see a great performance, in a film or a TV show, certain actors, your Philip Seymour Hoffmans and so on, there is music in the way they deliver. And that's what really, I guess, tickles my fancy when I'm doing the narrations for the show, is finding that musicality and the rhythm, that makes it, I suppose, compelling to listen to. The thing that I listen for when I hear narrations in audiobooks and podcasts and the like.
And have you done an audiobook before?
No, I haven't done an audiobook. There was unfortunately a bit of a scuttled project a while back where I was approached by a couple of chaps, one of whom was Dacre Stoker, who was a descendant of Bram Stoker, and another chap who works in screenwriting and comic books, actually. And they had this whole Stokerverse project they were working on. They had access to the estate through Dacre's kind of connection with the family, of course. And they were going to be revisiting the work of Bram Stoker, but also doing a lot of spin-off things, looking at specific characters like Renfield and so on, spinning off narratives. And doing graphic novels, producing audiobooks and all manner of things. And that was a very exciting project, and that approached me to sort of be pretty robustly involved in that. And we got to the stage of, contracts having been signed, and I was sending off a bunch of audio clips of various things for them to be discussing with the production company, but unfortunately the wheels fell off it. So I don't know if it's completely dead in the water, but that was that was a close call with doing a whole bunch of audiobook stuff, because there were going to be a whole heap of projects that would spin out from it. But at this stage, we're just in a holding pattern, I suppose. It's a twinkle in somebody's eye that might return at some point.
Well, then you heard it here, everyone. Kristin is open for commissions to audiobooks.
Well, actually, it was a desire to do audiobooks that kind of got me started before even knowing about podcasting. I had decided that I would like to do, again, through my interest, in voice acting and so on. I was actually looking at doing audiobook work, and that's how I actually trained myself to do this. Now, I don't know if I'd recommend this to anyone else, but many years ago, when I decided I'd like to get into doing audiobooks, or at least, find my way into the industry of voice acting, and I thought audiobooks at the time would be a thing to do, I would sit down with novels and I would essentially dictate them into my phone. So I would take something like, let me think of things I did, like, what's his name? Justin Cronin, I think, had a book called The Passage. I don't know if you've ever read that. I really enjoyed it, but I performed
Sounds
that.
Familiar.
Yeah. There's a sequel called The 12. There were a couple of sequel
Yes,
books, but the first one was...
read the first one and the 12.
Yeah, The Passage was the first one. I think The 12 might have been the second. And I think there's a third one, which I didn't read. But like that book, I just read it into my phone essentially, and then I would listen back to it like an audio book and just see where the weaknesses were in what I was doing. And I did that with a number of books. I did it with Crichton's Sphere. I did a lot of Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories, just all manner of stuff. I was just doing it as a way of training myself. No one has ever heard those recordings. In fact, pretty sure I erased them all. I just would do it, of an evening, spend a couple of hours just plowing through and recording. And then, over the next couple of days, I'd just listen to it in the car and then record more and just erase it and keep going. And that was my way of sort of training myself. But that was in preparation for what I thought would be doing audiobooks, which, I haven't really ended up doing. It's work that I'd certainly be open to. I've had a couple of offers, but I'm yet to receive something that has inspired me to want to take on the job, if that makes sense.
I think so. Being a creative project, I feel like you would want to at least vibe with it so that you could give it your whole passion,
Yeah, exactly. And really, audiobook work, it's a lot of work. Yeah, it's a sort of thing. I actually did meet with someone who was a professional voice artist working on audiobooks in the early days of me looking at getting into that work. And they confided that, you better love it because you're not doing it so you can roll around in money or anything. It's a lot of hours for not a lot of return. But if you have a passion for it, then it's worth the doing.
I feel like that can be said about like almost any art form, really. It's like you better be passionate about it and have a day job.
Of course, that is the story of the arts. Absolutely.
So then, what has been your biggest challenge getting into voice acting or being a voice actor?
Oh, I think, getting into voice acting, I suppose I just plowed my own path, As far as a challenge for me in the actual doing of it, with what I've set up for myself here with Nocturnal Transmissions, it's probably just the workload, in that I am doing it as a one-man show. So, and that's in the truest sense of like all the production, all the social media, any artwork, anything at all, sourcing the material, it's all just me. So that kind of really adds up. Just the actual recording and, and editing and the like, and particularly when it gets down to production, can be very time consuming. And when you're kind of going soup to nuts, it's kind of a full-time job. It's very time consuming. So the challenge for me is finding the time and letting go of them when it's time to release, because I fiddle. I fiddle with them right up until the moment I release them sometimes. It's that point of like, you never get it perfect, but there's a certain point where you have to stop and say, well, that's enough. So yeah, that's the kind of the way I work. So yeah, it's time is the challenge.
So then, talking about nocturnal transmissions in particular, like that's actually the reason I found you. Was I was looking for short story podcasts, and that's how I found you. And then eventually I got the courage to submit my own work. Been a fan.
And I'm glad you did.
But so why don't you tell the listeners a little about what Nocturnal Transmissions is about?
Certainly. It is a short horror story podcast that really just aims to provide that nice distraction of a short horror story, narrated in hopefully a compelling way, for listeners to enjoy when they just want to hear a nice little dark piece of fiction. It's something I enjoy, and I went to it because I was listening to a number of things like it. And I found what I was searching for. There are some excellent podcasts out there, but it wasn't finding exactly what I kind of wanted to hear and what I thought something like that could be. So I just decided, well, I'll see if I can create it. Short horror stories. And look, I cast a pretty wide net with what I perform, because it's, I'm pretty indulgent. So it's about me celebrating and just enjoying things that I like. So I sneak things in there that, strictly speaking, it's not your standard kind of horror fare. Saki, for instance. I adore the writer Saki. I came very close to actually starting a second podcast just of Saki's work. And at the 12th hour, I actually thought, I should be releasing this stuff just into Nocturnal Transmissions, because I realized I just didn't have the time to try and keep two things going at once at the level I kind of wanted to do it. That's why Saki gets his little appearances from time to time. That's why I allow myself to enjoy it. But, strictly speaking, I don't know if that would be appearing on a horror podcast as a rule, that kind of writing, or the little bits of Shakespeare I've done, or this and that. I've even featured fairy tales and the like. But it's just things that, I get a kick out of. And if there's any little dark thread that I can mine, I think that's justification enough to feature it in that framing device of a horror story podcast.
Yeah, I know. Going off what you mentioned, where there's a lot of short fiction podcasts out there, but they weren't quite hitting that spot. I mean, the reason I was drawn to Nocturnal Transmissions is the soundscaping and the fact that your narration is very much like Crypt Keeper ASMR. So it's quite lovely. There's a lot of good podcasts out there, but the narrators often sound like, and I'm not saying this to throw shade, but like a regular person reading, versus Nocturnal Transmissions definitely gives you that Crypt Keeper vibe, where it's like, it's fully horror, like ominous from start to finish.
Well, of course, the Crypt Keeper is, it's a bit of a trope, isn't it? I guess a lot of people have done their riffs on it, but yes, that's an inspiration behind that idea of having the framing device of the show's host. And the host is really, it's an alter ego in the true sense of like, that's kind of me with all my checks and balances taken away. That's kind of who I am if I don't pretend to be normal.
The mask comes off.
A little bit. So there you go. So it's dark fiction, but I would hope that the people who are attracted to the show, they like the fact that I do try and really push and pull what I'm doing in terms of the choice of material and the way it's performed. And I've had great feedback from people in that, it's nice that I think a lot of people get it, what I'm sort of driving at, that I want it to be a little bit. I figure if you don't hate some of the episodes, I mustn't be doing it right. I like to be challenging and just do some surprising things, and maybe sometimes something will come up where, somebody's like, well, that's not my cup of tea. I don't like that, but I'm not staying in one lane and playing around, and I just want to introduce things and just throw different ideas out there at the listeners, and at the same time that I sort of throw them at myself, see what I can do, and experiment. Yeah.
And how old is Nocturnal Transmissions at this point?
2017, I think, was the year I started.
So
Pretty
almost
sure
6 years old?
Yeah, it was early. It was like April or something in 2017. So yeah, it's yes, it is. It is a few years old now, isn't it? Doesn't feel it. It feels like yesterday, but yeah, 2017.
Then when you started it in 2017, what were your goals then in comparison to how your vision might have changed with the podcast now that we're closing in on 2023?
Well, I suppose, my initial goal was to have, I suppose I just wanted to have control over an outlet for what I was increasingly finding myself enjoying doing. Because how I actually started down this path was at that time, and I was, working on my performance, my narration, and doing those endless recordings of texts and listening back and just trying to train myself, essentially. A competition came up on one of the podcasts I listened to called the Simply Scary podcast, which I think is part of the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights network or something like that. It's the same outfit, but yeah, maybe it's Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. But they had a competition called Evil Idol, which, as the name suggests, is was the kind of a horror narration version of American
K-pop?
Idol or what have you. Kind of a talent show for kind of voice narration. This was I think they've done it over a few years now. I don't know if they still do it, but this was this was the inaugural competition. No, I didn't win. Spoilers, I didn't win. But I heard about it and I thought, oh, well, I'm working on these lines. This would be a good challenge. It'll be something concrete to actually have to deliver on. So I entered. And that was really me finding my feet and seeing if I could even do it, and having, I guess, it judged. And I think the competition was judged by listeners. I think they must have uploaded them to YouTube. They had a YouTube channel as well as the podcast. In fact, yes, it was all on YouTube. So the people who could vote on it somehow, they get comments, but I think there must have been some voting system. But I made it through all the way to the final. A lot of people seem to be responding really well to my work. So I was in the live final playoff where we had to perform live, actually, sort of for the purpose of the competition without pre-recording anything. And didn't win, but was inspired by the experience to want to keep going with that kind of work. And they approached me and asked me to contribute regularly to their show. So I was, being sent stories fairly regularly and narrating them for them, and quite often just appearing as a character in a show, sometimes just a grunting creature because they found I had a penchant for that. But
Monster number 78.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's my wheelhouse. That's my favorite thing to do. So I was doing stuff for them, and really I guess with someone else being in charge, there were just certain times I'd hear back what was done with what I had produced. I was like, oh, I don't like the way that was done. I would have done that differently. And the amount they wanted to use me probably wasn't as much as I wanted to be working. And that sort of spurred me on to say, well, I'll set up, I think through listening to other people, do this and listening more intently because I was involved, I thought, well, okay, I can tell I have some very clear ideas about how I think something like this should work. I'll try it. I'll put it out there, see if I'm, I sort of said to myself, if you're so clever, why don't you bloody do it then? So I did. I gave it a try. So the initial, impetus was really just to have an outlet for that creative urge. I hoped it would lead to potentially having some sort of brand out there, I suppose, for want of a better term, as a voice artist, where I might find other people to work with. And that has happened in my collaborations with Jack Afon Rees on A Voice from Darkness and other things I've worked on. It has brought me into a community of other people doing similar things. So, yeah, and as far as that changing, gosh, I don't know. I guess I'm at a point now where I don't know. I mean, it's just such a part of my routine after all these years of doing it that it's kind of just what I do. I don't know what I expect from it now. I just like to continue finding the audience that's out there that responds to what I do. I'm sure, we have a great listening, sort of a great, sort of following for the podcast with regular listeners. I'd like that to just keep growing. I'd like to keep finding more people who would enjoy what I what I like putting out there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And also, listeners, there is a Patreon where you can get exclusive content, and I would recommend joining it. I'm one of the patrons.
Yes, you are. Bless you.
Would definitely recommend. I feel like I listen to so many of the episodes. Although, to be fair, sometimes I listen to them at bed and your voice is like so nice, I fall asleep to it. And then I'm like, I didn't hear the end of that. And then I have to listen to the other half in the morning.
Oh, well, I'll take it. Look, even though I'm putting you to sleep, I'll still take it as a compliment.
It just means I have to listen to the episode twice.
Yeah. Oh, well, look, I wish people would. So many of these
there you
stories.
Go, listen to it twice.
Yeah. Oh, look, and this isn't to do with what I'm bringing to them, but so many of the stories, they're really, I'm pretty choosy about what I'll feature. I get a lot of submissions. I am constantly hit by a stream of stories being sent in from people, which is great and flattering that so many people have an interest in the show. But it's only a tip of that iceberg that I will perform on the show. I try to be pretty choosy about the sort of the quality of the writing and the sort of the ideas that I'm putting out there. But if I have chosen it, I think it's worthy. And I would hope that listeners, I've so often had feedback where folks have said, I've gone back and started listening back from the start of the podcast from the first episode and gone through again, or returned to certain stories they like and re-listen to them. And I love to hear that because I think, so many of them deserve it in the same way that, they deserve to be read multiple times. You'll take things from them, each time you revisit. So yes, so don't feel bad about listening twice, even if you're asleep for the first listen.
Only for the first half. Then speaking about that, how do you select your stories? Because you said you get a lot of submissions, and egotistically, I'd like to call out that 3 of my stories were chosen and produced by Kristin. So that's just saying something about me, but that's okay. But so
you should say no less than 3.
No less than 3, more to come.
No less than 3.
2023, the year of our collaboration.
Yeah, yes. We really must. We must keep this alive.
But so how do you select the stories? What kind of sparks your interest in adapting one?
Well, the stories are kind of sourced through, yes, I receive a lot of submissions. And quite often, as with your good self, I'm always happy to feature more than one story from a writer if they're interested in, featuring more than one. So I have a number of people who will, just from time to time, just drop me an email and say, hey, I've written something new. I think you might like this one. And I love that. It's nice when you have that kind of a relationship with a writer who just keeps you in the back of their mind that this would, that they'd like to see their work sort of featured on this platform. But I read through anthologies quite a lot, looking for writers I'm not aware of, and just find, just to find a story that's something new and lights my fire creatively. And of course, there's the classics. Over the years, I've read a lot of old classic horror material from Poe and Lovecraft and the like, and a lot of those just float around the back of my mind. And there's so many of them that are just there, waiting for the moment when I'll pull them down off the shelf to throw them in there. So, yeah, it's a combination of what's thrown at me, the pleasant surprises I get in my inbox, and what I find in just my own reading. And I suppose I haven't really addressed the question about what might make me want to choose a specific thing. I think anyone who's listened to the podcast over a period of time will realize that I like variation. Like I like, really, some horror is just like a great joke. It's a fun setup, and it can make you really cringe and feel uncomfortable. And then you got a great punchline, and that sort of horror is great. But then there's other types of horror where sometimes it's just a lovely sense of atmosphere throughout. Maybe there's no big payoff at the end, but the writer creates a feeling throughout the story that is just enjoyable to sit in. And then there are other writers, whose use of language is just so pleasant, and some, on the tongue too, just to be reading and writing, it just flows. Saki is a bit like that. Algernon Blackwood, I think, sometimes can have a quality like that too. There's a number where it's just pleasant, it's nicely written, and it's nice to speak. And sometimes I'll find a story that I find just darkly funny, and I like it when we can have some humor in there. I think horror is often funny. Even if it's blackest, there's always a strong element of humor in horror. The two work hand in hand. And yeah, I think maybe I've that well's running dry now. So yeah, I'm inspired by various things that make me want to perform a story. And I must say, I receive a lot of excellent stuff that's submitted that I don't perform simply because it just doesn't spark an idea. Mm-hmm. It's good in its own right. It's well written, but it has to be, I have to have a response where I think, oh, I'd love to do this because I could do this with this character or this voice, or I like this idea. It's like, I have to feel, how shall I put this? It's not a meritocracy. I don't choose material because I think it's good or, better than something else. It's about, oh, this gives me an idea. This sparks my creative juices. And then I'm inspired that I really want to do it because I like this character. I like this idea. I like this thing. Then, and that's a completely, very, I guess, subjective, arbitrary sort of thing that it just, either I get sparked by it or not,
Yeah, I can understand that. I feel like I can enjoy a story, and I can also enjoy a story, and it makes me keep thinking about it. I don't know if that's similar to what you mean.
Yeah, well, look, it's like music. You hear music, and sometimes you hear a song and it just speaks to you, and you want to hear it again and again, and you want to hear more from that artist. And other times you hear a song, I hear music that I know is good, that I appreciate on a level, but it's not my cup of tea. It doesn't inspire me to want to re-listen or engage with it more, and that's what it's like with the stories. It's just, sometimes it just touches something and it's like, okay, I'm resonating with this. it's making me want to engage. I want to do something with it. And other times it's just like, okay, that's great. I like that, but not my cup of tea. I'll move on to something else.
I mean, I totally understand that. I also had a bad day at work when I worked at an insurance place, and I listened to Carol of the Bells for like 3 hours straight. So could also be like a way out of madness. I still love that
That's
song.
called catharsis, I think.
Yeah, the Trans-Siberian Orchestra version is very moody, and it was exactly what I needed working in insurance during busy season. Oh Lord. So I think I understand not to break the mood there, but I think I understand. And then, so I don't want to keep you for much longer. So what can we expect from Nocturnal Transmissions in the new year as 2023 comes rushing upon us?
Yeah. Well, this year, I think, or maybe it was the very end of last year, I started with the idea of serializing larger pieces of work for the Patreon subscribers, who are so dear to me. They are the reason this is still happening. They really are. I couldn't justify the work without actually doing something like the Patreon thing. To be honest, I had a bit of a crisis of like, oh my God, you have a full-time job that you do for absolutely nothing. You probably need to go and do it. You know, if you're going to have another job, you better make it a source of income. So yes, it's very dear to me, the Patreon subscriber family that we have together. And for them next year, I'm going to be doing a lot more of the serialized work, which is because there's so many great things. I mean, so much Lovecraft and so on, where, you know, my initial thing with my idea with the podcast is just every episode is just a single isolated little unit, you know, a little lovely morsel of horror, and that's that. But the serialized stuff has been so embraced by the listeners, which is wonderful. It was a bit of an experiment of sorts, I suppose. And now I'm very keen to do a lot more of that for the listeners next year. We've had a little foray, of course, into Bram Stoker's Dracula at the end of this year. A lot of people have been asking me to do the entire book, but I think I would outstay my welcome if I did. So we'll probably finish that with the next episode. But you never know, we might return to Dracula and maybe another section of the book at some point in the future. But yes, more serialized stuff. I have kind of made a promise to myself that I will feature some more of my own writing next year. I've only ever used one of my own stories on the show.
The Green Princess, right?
Oh, yes, you know it. Oh, well, my little foray into having a little dabble with it myself. I will try and do more of that sort of thing next year. That's kind of where we're heading, I suppose. We might see some interesting developments with A Voice from Darkness next year, but that is yet to be seen. I know Jack is a very busy man, and as yourself, any regular listeners to the show will know that it's becoming a bit of a rare treat because he has a lot on his plate. So we don't get the content out there quite as often as would be ideal, but we'll see what happens in the new year.
That's awesome. So I will be putting the Patreon link in the show notes so people can check it out. I feel like all the tiers are very reasonable, and plus you're getting fully produced audio shows with that Patreon subscription.
I hope they're reasonable. I put a lot of I spent a long time.
For fully produced shows, I think so.
Yeah. Well, certainly the content there gets every bit as much love as the stuff that goes out in the mainstream, if not even a little bit more, dare I say.
Yeah, because and then you're going to be doing serial stuff for your Patreons.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we can tackle some of those, those nice There's nice big epic tales, like, certainly things like The Color from Outer Space is something I have my eye on. Maybe The Mountains of Madness. We'll certainly be looking at some more Algernon Blackwood in the new year, I would think. And yeah, just some of these work that I really like that is just too hefty to fit into like a single hour-long episode or something. So it looks like the listeners quite like that sort of thing. So be it. Let's press on and do some more.
And then my last question before I let you go is a secret question I didn't let you know about. But I saw in your bio, you're a fan of Scotch too. What's your favorite?
Yes.
Do you have a favorite? Because I'm a sherry cask girl.
Oh, well, I sort of change around. I'm a bit of a fan of Glenmorangie. Their Nectar d'Or, their golden nectar single malt. What else? I went through a stage where I just adored Lagavulin, which is a very robust Scotch. Big medicinal kind of notes in there, a lot of body. And that probably shows you that there's a bit of breadth, because Glenmorangie is a pretty kind of delicate Scotch. Lagavulin is the other end of the scale. So yeah, my mood kind of tells me what I'm going to be drinking. Sometimes I like them lighter, sometimes I like them a little bit bigger and smokier, even. And going for sort of Ardbeg or even sometimes Talisker. A nice smoky Talisker and an old-fashioned is pretty hard to beat. So yeah, no specific absolute favorite, but I reckon I buy Glenmorangie more than any other Scotch at the moment.
Yeah, I would say that's probably the brand I buy the most. I just tend to do the sherry casks because it has a bit of a smoother finish. I don't mind the rest, but sherry casks are the ones that I'm like, oh, here we go.
Yeah. I can understand that. Yeah, it's lovely. But nice to hear that you're a fellow Scotch lover yourself.
Absolutely. Now, again, thank you for coming on to PLM Talks. As a fan, I was so excited for this and nervous and like running around. And then when I realized that I had the times wrong, I was like, Kristin's going to think I'm just an unprofessional mess.
No. Well, I'm very flattered that you wanted to speak to me. I hope I was vaguely interesting, not least not too boring.
No, I think listeners are going to be excited. I mean, I know a lot of people. Well, I don't know actually a lot of people, but I've always been curious, like the aspects of podcasting, because it seems like so much work, and then like it's like you have to put so much effort into like one episode, and then it's so quickly consumed. And so I was wondering like what that process is like. So it was nice to hear you kind of explain it, like even getting into the nitty gritty of what like kind of equipment you might need, or if you need a separate space. So I'm sure others would find it interesting, unless I'm really weird in being interested in those kind of things.
Yeah. Look, I find it a very rewarding thing to do, because I suppose I have a little bit of a compulsion to do it. So, this is my outlet, my little labor of love.
Yes. So again, thank you. And everyone, if you're interested in Nocturnal Transmissions, there's a link to the podcast as well as to the Patreon and Kristin Holland's Nocturnal Transmissions website in the notes below. And thank you again.
No problem. All right. Well, you take care. And I hope that we'll collaborate on another story someday, sooner rather than later.
Oh, I'll definitely send you something.
Okay. Thank you, Pamela.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.